Alina Marsh stood frozen outside the glass door of her husband's office, the paper bag of takeout food shaking in her hand. Through the glass she could see Richard Hale leaning back in his chair, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something. It was their anniversary. She had planned to surprise him with his favorite meal, a quiet lunch between meetings, a small gesture after a year that had felt colder than the one before it. But the words drifting through the door were not the words of a man planning a celebration. "Yes, everything is set," Richard said. "The move happens next month. I already told them I am ready. No, she does not know yet." Alina's fingers tightened around the paper bag until the grease from the container soaked through onto her palm. She did not move. She did not breathe. She simply listened, the way a person listens to a storm they cannot stop, hoping that if they stay still enough, it might pass around them instead of through them. "There is no reason to wait," Richard continued. "I have made my decision. This is happening with or without her agreement." The bag slipped from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft thud, and the sound was enough. Richard turned in his chair and saw her standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a kind of disbelief that comes only once or twice in a lifetime. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself right away. He simply hung up the phone, straightened his tie, and looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected guest who has arrived at the wrong time. "Alina," he said, his voice flat and controlled, "I did not expect you here." "Clearly," she said, her voice trembling. "What was that? What move? What decision?" Richard sighed, as though her questions were an inconvenience rather than a fair response to what she had just heard. He stood, walked around his desk, and closed the office door behind her, shutting out the noise of the hallway. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. "Over dinner. I did not want you to find out like this." "Find out what, Richard?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. The warmth that had once lived there, the version of him she had married 11 years ago, seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by something cold and final. "I have made other arrangements," he said. The words landed like a blow. Alina felt the air leave her lungs. She had heard him say difficult things before, things about work, about disagreements, about the small frustrations that build in any marriage over a decade. But she had never heard him speak to her like this, as though she were an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be consulted. "What does that mean?" she asked, though some part of her already understood. "It means the company is opening a new branch overseas. I have accepted the position. I leave in 6 weeks." "You accepted it without talking to me first." "There was nothing to discuss," he said. "This is the opportunity I have been waiting for my entire career. I am not going to let it pass because you might feel uncertain about it." Alina felt her hands begin to shake. 11 years of marriage, and he was speaking to her as though she were a stranger standing in the way of his ambition. She thought of all the nights she had supported him, the sacrifices she had made for his career, the way she had quietly stepped back from her own opportunities so that his path could move forward. And now, in a single conversation, she understood that none of it had mattered the way she believed it did. "And what about us?" she asked. "What about our life here, my job, our home, our friends?" Richard's jaw tightened. "You can decide what you want to do. I am not asking you to come." The sentence hit her harder than anything before it. He was not asking her to come. He was not fighting for their marriage. He was simply informing her of a decision that had already been made, as though she were the last person to learn about her own future. "You are not asking me to come," she repeated slowly, testing the words, trying to understand how a man she had built a life with could say something so final without a flicker of hesitation. "I think it is better this way," Richard said. "We have been distant for a long time, Alina. You know that as well as I do." "Distant does not mean over," she said. "Distant means we needed to talk. Instead, you made plans behind my back and only told me because I happened to overhear you." He did not deny it. He simply stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her to finish so the conversation could end. It was in that silence, in that refusal to defend what they had built together, that Alina understood something had already died between them long before this moment. The move was not the ending. It was only the proof. She looked around his office, at the photographs on his desk, at the small framed picture of the two of them on their wedding day, smiling in a way that now felt like it belonged to different people entirely. She picked up the frame, studied it for a moment, then set it back down gently. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Richard exhaled, the first sign of discomfort he had shown since she walked in. 4 months, he admitted. The offer came 4 months ago. 4 months. Alina thought back over the last 4 months, the late nights he claimed were meetings, the trips he said were required for a project, the sudden distance that she had noticed but talked herself out of questioning. She had trusted him. She had given him the benefit of every doubt, telling herself that marriages go through difficult seasons and that patience was simply part of loving someone for the long term. "You let me believe we were struggling through something together," she said quietly. "The whole time you were planning to leave." "I was not trying to hurt you," Richard said, though his voice lacked the conviction that usually came with such a statement. "Then what were you trying to do?" He did not answer, and in that silence, Alina finally understood that there was no version of this conversation where he would choose her. He had already chosen. He had chosen weeks ago, months ago, quietly and without her, and the decision had simply been waiting for the right moment to be announced. She thought about arguing further, about demanding an explanation that would somehow make sense of everything, about reminding him of every year they had spent building something together. But looking at him now, standing behind his desk with the posture of a man who had already moved on in his mind, she realized that no argument would change what had already happened inside him. Alina reached down and slipped the wedding ring from her finger. It had been 11 years since he placed it there, promising a future that she now understood he had quietly abandoned without ever telling her. She looked at it for a long moment, the small diamond catching the office light, and then she set it gently on the corner of his desk, beside the framed photograph of the two of them. "Then I suppose there is nothing left to discuss," she said. Richard's expression flickered, something like surprise crossing his face for the first time since she had entered the room. Perhaps he had expected tears. Perhaps he had expected pleading or anger or a scene that would confirm everything he had already decided about her. Instead, she simply turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, her steps steady despite the storm rising inside her chest. "Alina," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Wait." She paused with her hand on the door handle, but did not turn around. "I did not mean for it to happen this way," he said. "But it did happen this way," she replied, "and now I know exactly who you are." She opened the door and walked out without looking back. The hallway outside felt longer than she remembered, the fluorescent lights harsh against her skin, the sound of her own footsteps the only thing she could hear over the roar of her thoughts. She passed his coworkers without meeting their eyes, past the reception desk where a young woman glanced up and then quickly looked away, sensing that something significant had just taken place behind that closed door. Outside, the afternoon sun felt strange against her face, too bright, too ordinary for a day that had just split her life into a clear before and after. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go, unsure of what came next. The car was parked 2 blocks away, but her legs did not want to move in that direction. Instead, she found a bench near the building entrance and sat down, staring at her bare hand, at the pale mark where her ring had been for over a decade. She did not cry, not yet. The shock was still too large, too new, sitting in her chest like a stone she had not yet learned how to carry. She thought about calling her sister, Marissa, the only person who might understand the weight of what had just happened. But her phone remained in her bag, untouched, as she sat in the strange stillness that follows a life-changing moment before the real emotions arrive. Behind her, through the tall windows of the building, she imagined Richard picking up the ring from his desk, perhaps turning it over in his hand, perhaps feeling nothing at all. She would never know for certain what he felt in that moment. She only knew what she felt, sitting alone on a bench on an ordinary afternoon, having just walked away from the only marriage she had ever known. The wind picked up slightly, cool against her skin, carrying with it the distant sound of traffic and the ordinary rhythm of a city that had no idea her entire world had just changed. She thought of the takeout bag she had dropped inside his office, the food probably going cold on the floor beside his desk, a small, forgotten symbol of the anniversary they would never celebrate. She stood up slowly, smoothed the front of her dress, and began walking toward her car. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet somehow also lighter, as though she were shedding something she had been carrying for longer than she realized. She did not know yet what her life would look like without him. She did not know where she would sleep that night, or how she would explain this to their friends, or what she would do with the wedding album sitting on the shelf at home. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she reached her car and slid into the driver's seat, hands finally trembling now that no one was watching. She was never going back to that office. She was never going to wait by the phone for an apology that would probably never come. Richard had made his arrangements without her, and now, for the first time in 11 years, Alina was going to have to make her own. She started the engine, pulled out of the parking space, and drove away from the building where her marriage had quietly ended, not with shouting, not with tears, but with 4 simple words that would echo in her mind for the rest of her life. I have made other arrangements. As she merged onto the main road, she caught her own reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were red but dry. Her jaw was set. She did not recognize the woman looking back at her, not yet, but she had the strange feeling that she was about to. Somewhere behind her, in an office with a cold cup of coffee, and a photograph turned slightly on its side, Richard Hale sat alone with a small gold ring in his palm, wondering, perhaps for the first time in months, whether the arrangements he had made were truly worth what he had just lost. But Alina did not look back to find out. She kept driving, further and further from the life she once knew, toward a future she could not yet see but had already decided to build entirely on her own terms. Marissa opened the door before Alina even knocked, her expression already tight with concern. She had been calling since noon, ever since a strange, unanswered silence had stretched across their usual afternoon messages. Alina stood on the porch, her makeup faded, her eyes hollow, and Marissa did not need to ask what had happened. She simply pulled her sister inside and wrapped her arms around her without a single word. "He told me he made other arrangements," Alina finally said, her voice cracking against her sister's shoulder. "He is leaving the country in 6 weeks. He never asked me to come." Marissa led her to the couch, sat her down gently, and brought a glass of water that Alina did not touch. For a long while neither of them spoke. The television remained off, the house quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that suddenly felt unbearably loud. "How long have you known something was wrong?" Marissa finally asked. Alina thought about the question honestly, the way she had not allowed herself to think about it in months. She thought back to the early signs, the ones she had noticed but quietly dismissed, telling herself that every marriage moves through seasons of distance. It had started nearly 2 years earlier in small and forgettable ways. Richard began working later, arriving home after Alina had already gone to bed, leaving before she woke. He said it was pressure at work, a difficult quarter, a demanding new manager who expected long hours. Alina believed him because there was no reason not to. She had watched him build his career from nothing, watched him take on responsibilities that once seemed impossible, and she had always been proud of the effort he poured into his work. But somewhere along the way, the late nights stopped feeling temporary. They became permanent, a fixture of their life together, and Alina slowly adjusted her own expectations to match. She stopped waiting up for him. She stopped asking about his day because his answers had become short and distracted. She filled the empty hours with her own work, with friends, with a version of independence that felt, at the time, like healthy adaptation rather than a warning sign. Their friends had noticed before she allowed herself to. At a dinner party 6 months earlier, her friend Claire had pulled her aside in the kitchen and asked, gently, if everything was all right between her and Richard. Alina had laughed it off, insisting they were simply busy, that marriages required patience during demanding seasons. Claire had not pushed further, but the look on her face lingered in Alina's memory, a look of quiet worry that Alina had chosen not to examine too closely. Even her mother, during a phone call months earlier, had asked carefully why Richard never joined their weekend calls anymore. Alina had made an excuse about his schedule, about the pressures of his position, though even as she said it, some small part of her recognized the excuse for what it was, a shield against a truth she was not ready to face. Now, sitting on her sister's couch with her wedding ring gone from her hand, Alina finally allowed herself to see the pattern clearly. The late nights were not about work. Or perhaps they had started that way, but somewhere along the timeline, they had become something else entirely, a slow and quiet withdrawal from the marriage itself. "I think I always felt it," Alina admitted. "I just did not want to believe it was as serious as it turned out to be." "You cannot blame yourself for trusting your husband," Marissa said firmly. "That is not weakness, Alina. That is what marriage is supposed to look like." "Then why does it feel like I should have seen this coming?" Marissa took her sister's hand. "Because hindsight makes everything look obvious, but you were not living with hindsight. You were living inside a marriage, trying to make it work the best way you knew how." Alina stared at the wall across from her, unseeing, replaying moments she had never fully understood until now. She thought of Richard's phone, always turned face down on the nightstand, a habit that had started around the same time as the late nights. She thought of the business trips that grew more frequent, more unpredictable, requiring departures with little notice and returns that felt rushed and distracted. She thought of the way he had stopped reaching for her hand in public, stopped kissing her goodbye in the mornings, small absences that had accumulated so gradually she had barely noticed them slipping away. "There was a woman," Alina said suddenly, the realization arriving with startling clarity. "There has to be. This is not just about a job overseas." Marissa did not answer right away. She had wondered the same thing for months, watching Richard grow more distant at family gatherings, more careful with his words, more guarded in ways that had nothing to do with career stress. "Does it matter?" Marissa finally asked. "Whether there was someone else or not, he still chose to build a future without telling you. He still called it an arrangement instead of a conversation. That alone tells you everything you need to know about where his mind has been." Alina nodded slowly, though the question would not leave her. She thought of Vanessa, a colleague from Richard's company who had joined several of their dinner parties over the past year. Always polished, always confident, always seated a little too close to Richard during conversations that Alina had once dismissed as simple professional friendliness. She remembered a comment Vanessa had made once, casually, about international opportunities within the company, and how Richard had smiled in a way that Alina had not understood at the time. She did not have proof. She might never have proof. But the pieces, once scattered and separate, now seemed to arrange themselves into a picture she did not want to see but could no longer ignore. That night, Alina lay awake in her sister's guest room, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying 11 years of marriage as though searching for the exact moment everything had begun to unravel. She thought of their wedding day, the promises they had made in front of family and friends, promises that had once felt unbreakable. She thought of the early years, when Richard would call her simply to hear her voice during his lunch break, when he would leave small notes for her to find before she left for work, thoughtful gestures that had faded so slowly, she had not noticed their absence until they were completely gone. She thought, too, of her own choices during those years. The promotion she had turned down 3 years earlier because it would have required more travel, more time away from a marriage she believed needed her presence. The friendships she had let drift because Richard's schedule always seemed to take priority. The parts of herself she had quietly folded away, believing that sacrifice was simply what marriage required. Now, lying in the darkness of an unfamiliar bed, she wondered how much of herself she might be able to recover, and how much had been lost permanently in the process of building a life that, in the end, one person had been willing to abandon without a second thought. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it slowly, half expecting a message from Richard, some attempt at explanation or apology. Instead, it was Claire, checking in after hearing secondhand from a mutual friend that something had happened. Alina stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a short reply, confirming that yes, something had happened, and no, she did not want to talk about it yet. Claire responded within seconds, offering support without pressure, promising to be there whenever Alina was ready. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Alina set the phone down and closed her eyes, though sleep remained far away. Her mind kept returning to the office, to the sound of Richard's voice on the phone, calm and certain, discussing a decision that would upend her entire life as though it were nothing more than a scheduling detail. She thought about the years she had spent believing that patience and loyalty were enough to sustain a marriage through difficult seasons. She thought about how wrong that belief now seemed, how naive it felt to have trusted so completely in a partnership that had apparently been quietly dissolving behind her back for months, perhaps longer. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook her, though her sleep was shallow and restless, filled with fragmented images of empty offices and closed doors. When she woke the next morning, sunlight spilling through unfamiliar curtains, there was a brief, disorienting moment where she forgot everything that had happened. Then the memory returned all at once, settling over her like a heavy blanket she could not shake off. Marissa was already in the kitchen when Alina emerged, coffee brewing, the smell filling the small apartment with a comforting warmth that felt entirely out of place given the circumstances. Marissa handed her a mug without a word, and the two sisters sat together at the small kitchen table, watching the steam rise between them. "What are you going to do?" Marissa finally asked. Alina wrapped both hands around the warm mug, considering the question seriously for the first time since walking out of Richard's office. There were practical matters to address, matters she had not yet allowed herself to think about. Their shared home, their joint finances, the life insurance policies, the retirement accounts, the small but significant details that had been intertwined for over a decade and would now need to be carefully separated. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I know I am not going back." Marissa reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. "Then we will figure the rest out together, one step at a time." Alina nodded, grateful for the certainty in her sister's voice, even as uncertainty churned inside her own chest. She thought of the ring sitting on Richard's desk, wondering if he had even noticed it yet, wondering if he felt anything at all beyond mild inconvenience at the scene she had refused to give him. She thought, too, of the 6 weeks remaining before his departure, 6 weeks that would require decisions about their home, their belongings, their shared life that needed to be carefully unwound. It felt impossible, overwhelming, like standing at the base of a mountain she had no idea how to climb. But sitting there in her sister's kitchen, coffee warming her hands, morning light filtering gently through the window, Alina felt something else beginning to stir beneath the grief and the shock. It was small, barely noticeable at first, easy to mistake for simple determination. But as the morning wore on, she began to recognize it for what it truly was. It was the first quiet flicker of relief. Not because the pain was gone, not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because for the first time in nearly 2 years, she no longer had to pretend that everything was fine. She no longer had to make excuses for empty seats at dinner or unanswered calls or the slow, creeping distance that had settled into every corner of her marriage. The truth, however devastating, was finally out in the open, and there was a strange kind of freedom in that clarity, even amid the wreckage it had left behind. Alina finished her coffee, set the mug down, and looked at her sister with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I need to go back to the house," she said. "Not for him, for my things. And to start figuring out what comes next." Marissa studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that Alina was not truly ready. Finding none, she simply nodded. "Then let us go together," she said. "You should not have to face that house alone." Alina managed a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression to cross her face since the previous afternoon. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was something close to resolve, a quiet promise to herself that whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her spine straight, no longer waiting for someone else to decide her worth. The house looked exactly the same as it had the day before, which somehow made everything feel stranger. The porch light was still burned out, something Richard had promised to fix weeks earlier. The garden hose was still coiled in the same careless loop by the side door. Nothing about the outside of the house reflected the earthquake that had just torn through Alina's life, and that quiet normalcy felt almost cruel. Marissa parked in the driveway, and for a moment, neither sister moved. Alina stared at the front door, keys resting in her palm, feeling the strange heaviness of unlocking a home that no longer felt like it belonged to her. "You do not have to do this today," Marissa said gently. "Yes, I do," Alina replied. "If I wait, I will lose my nerve completely." She stepped out of the car, and Marissa followed close behind. The front door opened with the same familiar creak it always had, and the smell of home rushed toward her immediately, a mixture of the lavender candles she kept on the shelf and the faint trace of coffee from that morning's abandoned routine. It was disorienting, how ordinary it all felt, how untouched, as though the walls themselves had no idea that everything had changed. Alina moved through the living room slowly, running her fingers along the back of the couch, remembering the countless evenings she had spent there, alone, waiting for Richard to come home from work that she now understood had not always been work at all. The framed photographs on the mantel stared back at her, each one a small monument to a version of their marriage that had clearly stopped being real long before she noticed its absence. "Where do you want to start?" Marissa asked, pulling a stack of empty boxes from the trunk of her car. "The bedroom," Alina said. "I need my clothes, my personal things, everything that is truly mine." They worked in silence for the first several minutes, moving through the closet methodically, folding clothes into boxes with a kind of mechanical focus that made the task feel almost bearable. Alina avoided looking at Richard's side of the closet, at his neatly hung suits and polished shoes, evidence of a life that would soon exist thousands of miles away from wherever she ended up. It was while reaching for a sweater on the top shelf that Alina's hand brushed against something unexpected, a small shoebox tucked far back where it clearly was not meant to be found by accident. She pulled it down carefully, curiosity overtaking her hesitation, and opened the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them handwritten, tied loosely with a ribbon that had clearly been untied and retied many times. Alina's hands trembled as she lifted the first one, recognizing immediately that the handwriting was not her own. Marissa appeared beside her, glancing at the box with growing concern. "Alina, you do not have to read those right now." But Alina was already unfolding the first letter, her eyes scanning the familiar looping script she now recognized from years of seeing Vanessa's handwriting on shared work documents that had occasionally ended up in their home. The letter was dated 14 months earlier, and within the first few lines, any remaining doubt about the nature of Richard's absence over the past year evaporated completely. The words were careful, affectionate, filled with references to stolen weekends and promises of a future that had clearly been under construction for far longer than Alina had ever suspected. There were mentions of the overseas position, discussions about timing, about how much longer they would need to wait before making everything official. Alina felt her stomach twist as she read a line describing how relieved Vanessa was that Richard had finally made his decision, a phrase that echoed painfully against the words he had spoken to Alina just the day before. "He has been planning this for over a year," Alina said quietly, her voice hollow with the weight of the discovery. "Not 4 months, a year." Marissa took the letter gently from her sister's shaking hands, scanning it briefly before folding it back and returning it to the box. "Alina, I am so sorry." Alina sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, staring at the small pile of letters that represented over a year of quiet betrayal happening in the same house, where she had continued to make dinner, fold laundry, and wait patiently for a husband who had already emotionally left long before he ever announced it out loud. "All those late nights," she said almost to herself, "all those excuses, I believed every single one of them." "You believed him because you trusted him," Marissa said firmly. "That is not a flaw in you, Alina, that is a flaw in him." Alina nodded, though the words did little to soften the sharp ache spreading through her chest. She thought back to the dinner parties, the moments she had seen Vanessa and Richard laughing together, always dismissing the closeness as simple professional comfort. She thought of the late nights, the sudden trips, the growing distance she had attributed to career pressure, never once suspecting the truth hiding in plain sight. She thought, too, of something Vanessa had said months earlier, at a company gathering Alina had attended out of obligation. Vanessa had mentioned, almost casually, an interest in international assignments, a comment Alina had brushed aside without a second thought. Now, sitting in the quiet of her own bedroom, the memory returned with painful new clarity. "I need to know everything," Alina said suddenly, standing up with a renewed sense of purpose. "Not to torture myself, but because I refuse to walk away from this marriage without understanding exactly what I am walking away from." Marissa did not argue. She simply helped Alina gather the remaining letters, along with several photographs tucked at the bottom of the box, images of Richard and Vanessa together at locations Alina did not recognize, smiling in ways that felt achingly familiar, the same smile Richard used to reserve only for her in the early years of their marriage. As they continued packing, Alina found other small signs scattered throughout the house, details she had overlooked or explained away during the months when denial had felt safer than confrontation. A second phone charger in the guest room closet that did not match any device Richard owned. A receipt from a hotel 2 towns over, dated on a weekend Alina had believed him to be at a work conference. A bottle of perfume in the back of the bathroom cabinet that was not her own scent, forgotten or perhaps deliberately hidden in a place she rarely searched. Each discovery added another layer to the picture forming in her mind, a picture of a marriage that had been slowly and deliberately dismantled from the inside, while she continued believing they were simply moving through a difficult season together. The betrayal was not a single moment. It was a slow erosion, built from countless small deceptions that had accumulated into something enormous. By the time they finished packing the last box, several hours had passed, and the late afternoon light had shifted into the golden haze of early evening. Alina stood in the doorway of what had once been her bedroom, looking at the space one final time, trying to memorize the version of herself that had lived there, hoping and trusting and believing in a marriage that had already quietly ended long before she was given the chance to fight for it. "I am ready to go," she said finally. They loaded the boxes into Marissa's car, and Alina took one last look at the house before climbing into the passenger seat. She did not cry as they pulled out of the driveway, though the temptation lingered somewhere beneath her ribs. Instead, she felt something colder and more resolute settling into place, a clarity that had not existed 24 hours earlier. She no longer needed answers from Richard, because she had found them herself, tucked away in a shoebox he had foolishly believed she would never discover. She no longer needed him to explain his other arrangements, because she now understood exactly what those arrangements had always meant. And she no longer felt the need to protect a version of their marriage that had, in truth, stopped existing long before she ever placed her ring on his desk. As the car merged onto the highway, leaving the house and its carefully hidden secrets behind, Alina pulled out her phone and opened a blank message to her lawyer, a contact she had saved months earlier during a period of anxious uncertainty she had never fully understood until now. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a long moment before she began to type, calmly and deliberately, requesting the earliest possible appointment to begin the process of legally ending a marriage that had already ended in every way that truly mattered. She sent the message, set the phone in her lap, and looked out the window at the passing lights of the city, feeling, for the first time since walking out of Richard's office, a strange and unfamiliar sense of control returning to her life. Beside her, Marissa reached over and squeezed her hand without a word, and Alina squeezed back, grateful for the silent support of someone who had never once doubted her, even when she had spent months doubting herself. The road stretched ahead of them, unfamiliar and uncertain, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina did not feel afraid of where it might lead. She felt, instead, a quiet and growing determination to walk it entirely on her own terms, no matter how long the journey turned out to be. Richard sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, the small gold ring resting on his desk exactly where Alina had left it. He had not moved it. He had not touched it. He simply stared at it, as though looking at it long enough might somehow rewrite the events of the afternoon into something less permanent. The takeout bag still lay on the floor near the door, forgotten in the chaos, a small container of his favorite dish now cold and untouched. He glanced at it once, then looked away, unable to reconcile the image of Alina walking through that door with the anniversary lunch she had planned against the version of her that had walked out without a single tear. He told himself at first that she would call. She always called, even during their worst arguments, always the one to reach out first, to smooth things over, to find a way back to steady ground. He waited through the evening, his phone resting face up on the desk, refreshing his messages every few minutes with a growing unease he refused to name. By 9 o'clock, the call had not come. By 11, he finally admitted to himself that it might not come at all. He drove home to an empty house that felt unfamiliar in its silence, the kind of quiet that pressed against his ears in a way he had never noticed before. Alina's side of the closet stood open, though he did not yet realize she and her sister had already come and gone, taking what mattered most and leaving the rest behind as though it belonged to strangers. He poured himself a drink he did not finish, sat at the kitchen table where they had shared thousands of meals together, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to actually think about what he had done. He had told himself for over a year that his relationship with Vanessa was separate from his marriage, a compartment he could keep sealed away from the rest of his life. He had convinced himself that the late nights, the trips, the growing distance from Alina were simply the natural result of career pressure, a narrative he repeated so often that he had almost come to believe it himself. But sitting there in the silence of the house he had built with Alina, he could no longer maintain the illusion. He had chosen Vanessa, slowly and deliberately, choice by choice, over the course of more than a year. He had chosen the excitement of something new over the steady, quiet partnership he had built with his wife. And today, faced with the sudden reality of losing that steady partnership entirely, he found himself unprepared for how hollow the alternative actually felt. He thought of Alina's face in his office, the shock giving way to something colder, something final. He had expected anger. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even a scene that would allow him to justify his decision as a reasonable response to an unreasonable reaction. Instead, she had simply removed her ring, set it on his desk, and walked away with a composure that had unsettled him more than any outburst could have. The following days passed in a strange blur. Richard went through the motions of his job, finalized details for the overseas position, and told himself repeatedly that everything was proceeding according to plan. But small cracks began appearing in his certainty, moments where he would reach for his phone to share something with Alina out of pure habit, only to remember that she was gone. Vanessa noticed his distraction almost immediately. She had expected him to arrive at her apartment that evening with news of a clean and simple conversation, a marriage ended without complication, ready to be replaced by the future they had been quietly building together. Instead, she found him distant, distracted, staring at his phone as though willing it to ring. "You look like a man who is having second thoughts," she said carefully, watching him from across the room. "I am not having second thoughts," Richard replied, though the words lacked their usual confidence. "I am simply adjusting to everything happening so quickly." "You told her today, that is what you wanted." "I know what I wanted," he said, sharper than he intended. "I just did not expect her to leave so easily." Vanessa studied him for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her expression. "Did you expect her to fight for you?" The question landed with an uncomfortable weight, because the honest answer was yes. Some part of him, buried beneath months of careful rationalization, had genuinely believed that Alina would fight, that she would beg him to reconsider, that her love for him would be strong enough to override the betrayal she had just discovered. Her calm departure had shattered that expectation entirely, leaving him with a version of the situation he had never prepared himself to handle. Over the following 2 weeks, Richard attempted to reach Alina several times, first through text messages that went unanswered, then through phone calls that rang until voicemail picked up, her familiar recorded voice a strange and painful reminder of everything he had lost. He told himself each attempt was simply about practical matters, about the house, about their shared finances, about the logistics of an ending that required careful handling. But beneath the surface, he knew he was searching for something else entirely, some acknowledgement that she still cared enough to respond. Alina's lawyer eventually reached out instead, formal and precise, outlining the beginning stages of a divorce process that would proceed with clean and deliberate efficiency. Richard read the email twice, feeling a strange numbness settle over him as the reality of the situation became undeniably official. He had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the transition would feel liberating, that the freedom from a marriage that had grown distant and routine would open the door to the excitement he had been chasing for over a year. Instead, he found himself increasingly haunted by memories he had not expected to resurface, small moments from the early years of his marriage that had somehow been buried beneath the weight of his more recent choices. He remembered the way Alina used to leave notes for him before he left for work, small reminders that she was thinking of him even during the busiest mornings. He remembered her laugh, easy and genuine, the kind that had first drawn him to her over a decade earlier. He remembered the quiet comfort of coming home to someone who knew him completely, flaws and all, without requiring him to perform or impress. These memories arrived at inconvenient moments, during meetings, during dinners with Vanessa, during the quiet hours of the night when sleep refused to come. He tried to push them away, telling himself that nostalgia was simply a natural response to significant change, that the discomfort would fade once the overseas move finally took place and the new chapter of his life truly began. But the discomfort did not fade. If anything, it deepened, especially as small complications began appearing in the business deal that was supposed to anchor his new life abroad. A shift in leadership at the overseas branch introduced uncertainty into the timeline. Budget concerns delayed the finalization of his exact role and compensation. What had once felt like an unshakable opportunity now carried an unfamiliar fragility that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Vanessa, too, seemed to sense the shifting ground beneath them. Her enthusiasm, once boundless, began to carry an edge of tension whenever the topic of the move arose. She had built her own plans around this new chapter, around a future she believed had been carefully secured, and the growing uncertainty threatened the foundation she had been counting on. "Is everything still happening the way we discussed?" she asked one evening, her voice tighter than usual. "There are some complications," Richard admitted. "Nothing that cannot be resolved, but the timeline may shift." Vanessa's expression flickered with something close to worry, though she quickly masked it with practiced composure. "How much of a shift are we talking about?" "I do not know yet," Richard said honestly, and for the first time he heard in his own voice an uncertainty that unsettled him deeply. That night, alone in the house that no longer felt like a home, Richard found himself standing in the doorway of what had once been Alina's side of the closet, now completely empty except for a few wire hangers swaying slightly in the draft from the hallway. He stared at the empty space for a long time, feeling something he had not expected to feel so strongly. Regret. Not regret for the choices he had made in pursuing something new, not entirely, but regret for the careless way he had dismantled something valuable without ever pausing to consider whether the trade was truly worth what he had given up. He thought of Alina's calm composure as she left his office, the absence of tears or pleading, and he realized now that her silence had not been weakness at all. It had been the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided she deserved better than the arrangement he had offered her. He picked up his phone one final time that night and typed out a message to Alina, longer and more honest than any of his previous attempts. He wrote about the letters she had likely found, about the year of deception he could no longer deny, about the fear that had driven him to choose something new rather than face the slow, quiet work of repairing what had grown distant between them. He wrote, finally, that he was sorry, not simply for getting caught, but for the choices themselves, choices he now understood had cost him far more than he had ever anticipated. He read the message 3 times before finally pressing send, watching the small indicator confirm delivery, then waiting in the silence of the empty house for a response that, deep down, he already suspected would never come. The message sat unanswered for days, then weeks, a quiet monument to an apology that had arrived far too late to matter. Richard continued moving forward with the practical details of his life, the divorce proceedings, the shifting overseas position, the increasingly strained relationship with Vanessa that seemed to fracture a little more each week under the weight of uncertainty neither of them had anticipated. But somewhere beneath the surface of his carefully maintained composure, Richard Hale had begun to understand a truth he had spent over a year avoiding. The arrangements he had made so confidently, the future he had built in secret while his marriage quietly deteriorated behind him, had never truly been as solid as he believed. And now, faced with the growing cracks in every part of the life he had chosen instead of his wife, he found himself wondering, for the first time with real honesty, whether he had made a mistake that could never be undone. 3 weeks after leaving the house on Ashford Lane, Alina found herself sitting across from a lawyer named Patricia Yull, a sharp and steady woman who specialized in cases exactly like her own. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and the steady hum of the city outside the window offered a strange comfort as Alina signed the final documents that would formally begin the end of her marriage. "You are entitled to half of the shared assets," Patricia explained, sliding a folder across the desk. "Given the letters and photographs you found, along with the timeline of infidelity, the settlement is likely to favor you significantly, especially considering his decision to relocate internationally." Alina nodded, absorbing the information with a calm she still found surprising, even to herself. In the weeks since walking out of Richard's office, she had expected the grief to consume her entirely, to leave her unable to function through even the simplest tasks. Instead, she found herself moving forward with a steady, methodical determination, tackling one practical matter after another with a clarity she had not possessed in years. The most difficult part had not been the legal proceedings, nor the division of shared finances, nor even the quiet, humiliating process of explaining to friends and family what had happened. The most difficult part had been rebuilding the smaller, quieter pieces of her identity that had slowly disappeared over 11 years of marriage, pieces she had not even realized were missing, until she began the slow work of searching for them again. She remembered, with a mixture of nostalgia and quiet anger, how she used to paint before she married Richard, spending weekend afternoons lost in color and canvas, a hobby that had gradually faded away as marriage responsibilities, and his career demands consumed more and more of her time. She remembered the friendships she had let drift, women she once considered close who had slowly become distant acquaintances as her world shrank around Richard's schedule and priorities. Rebuilding these pieces felt, at times, like meeting a stranger. She purchased a small set of paints one afternoon, almost on impulse, standing in the art supply aisle of a local shop feeling both excited and strangely nervous, as though she needed permission to reclaim something that had once been entirely her own. That evening, in the small guest room she had converted into a temporary living space within Marissa's apartment, she opened the paints for the first time in over a decade, and simply let herself create without any particular goal in mind. The first few strokes felt clumsy and uncertain, her hand unfamiliar with the movements it had once known instinctively. But slowly, gradually, something within her began to loosen, a tightness she had not realized she was carrying finally beginning to release with each new color added to the canvas. She did not create anything remarkable that first night, simply abstract shapes and colors reflecting the chaos of her emotions. But the act itself felt like reclaiming a small, important piece of who she used to be before she had folded so much of herself away to accommodate a marriage that ultimately had not valued her the way she deserved. Financially, the situation proved more complicated than she initially anticipated. Untangling over a decade of joint accounts, shared credit cards, and combined investments required careful attention and countless hours of paperwork. Alina discovered, during this process, just how much of her financial identity had become intertwined with Richard's, how few accounts existed solely in her own name, how dependent she had unknowingly become on a partnership she had trusted completely. She threw herself into correcting this imbalance with a determination that surprised even Marissa. She opened new accounts entirely in her own name, carefully building a financial foundation that belonged to her alone. She revisited her career, a marketing position she had once found fulfilling before scaling back her ambitions to accommodate Richard's demanding schedule, and began exploring opportunities for advancement that she had quietly set aside years earlier. Her manager, a thoughtful woman named Priya who had worked alongside Alina for nearly 6 years, noticed the shift almost immediately. "You seem different lately," Priya commented one afternoon, watching Alina present a new marketing strategy with a confidence that had been noticeably absent in recent months. In a good way, sharper somehow. Alina smiled, appreciating the observation more than Priya likely realized. "I think I am finally remembering who I used to be before I started making myself smaller to fit into someone else's life." Priya nodded thoughtfully. "There is an opening for a senior strategist position next quarter. I think you should apply." The suggestion caught Alina off guard, though not unpleasantly. It was a position she would have once dismissed immediately, telling herself that the increased responsibility and travel would create tension in her marriage that was not worth the professional advancement. Now, without that constraint weighing on her decisions, she found herself genuinely considering the opportunity, turning it over in her mind with growing interest rather than immediate hesitation. The practical rebuilding of her life continued alongside this quieter, internal rebuilding, and though the days remained difficult, Alina began noticing small moments of genuine contentment scattered throughout the grief. A quiet morning with coffee and her paints. A dinner with Claire, who listened without judgment as Alina finally spoke honestly about everything she had discovered in that shoebox. A weekend spent apartment hunting with Marissa, searching for a space that would belong entirely to Alina alone, decorated according to her own taste, rather than compromises reached over years of shared decisions. She found the apartment nearly a month after leaving Richard, a modest but bright space on the 3rd floor of a converted building near the edge of the city, with tall windows that let in generous morning light and a small balcony overlooking a quiet street lined with old trees. Standing in the empty rooms during her first walkthrough, Alina felt something unfamiliar rising within her chest, something she had not expected to feel so soon after everything that had happened. Hope. Not the desperate, uncertain hope she had clung to during the final months of her marriage, hoping that things would somehow improve if she simply remained patient and understanding. This was a different kind of hope entirely, quieter and steadier, rooted in the growing understanding that she was fully capable of building a meaningful life on her own terms, without needing anyone else's permission or approval to do so. She signed the lease the following week, and Marissa helped her move in over a long weekend, the two sisters laughing more than either had expected as they assembled furniture and argued playfully over where certain pieces should go. By the end of the weekend, standing in her new living room surrounded by boxes still waiting to be unpacked, Alina felt a genuine sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with Richard or the marriage she had left behind. That evening, after Marissa had gone home, Alina sat alone on her new balcony, watching the sun set over unfamiliar rooftops, a glass of wine resting untouched on the small table beside her. She thought about the version of herself who had sat frozen outside Richard's office door just over a month earlier, terrified and heartbroken, unable to imagine what her future might look like without the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. That version of herself felt distant now, not gone entirely, but transformed into something steadier and more resilient. She thought of the letters she had discovered, the year of quiet betrayal she had uncovered, and she realized that the pain of that discovery, while still present, no longer held the same paralyzing power it once had. She had faced the worst of it, examined it honestly, and had begun the slow, deliberate work of building something new from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed softly on the table beside her, and she glanced down to see a message from an unknown number, though the area code was familiar enough that she suspected immediately who it might be from. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, and found a lengthy message from Richard, longer and more honest than anything he had sent her since the day she left his office. She read through it slowly, absorbing his admission of the affair, his acknowledgement of the year of deception, his apology that arrived weeks too late to change anything meaningful about her decision to leave. She felt a complicated mixture of emotions as she read, a flicker of old hurt resurfacing alongside a stronger, steadier sense of distance, as though the words belonged to a chapter of her life she had already closed and had no intention of reopening. She did not respond that evening. Instead, she set the phone aside, picked up her wine glass, and turned her attention back to the darkening sky, watching the first stars begin to appear over the quiet street below. She thought of her new apartment, her rediscovered paints, the senior strategist position she had decided to apply for the following morning, and the friendships she was slowly, deliberately rebuilding. None of it erased the pain of what Richard had done, the year of betrayal hidden carefully behind careful lies and late-night excuses. But none of it needed to be erased in order for her to move forward. She was learning, slowly and steadily, that healing did not require forgetting, and that building a new life did not require pretending the old one had never happened. She simply needed to keep moving forward, one deliberate choice at a time, building something entirely her own from the pieces that remained. And for the first time since that terrible afternoon in Richard's office, Alina Marsh felt genuinely, quietly certain that she was capable of doing exactly that. The stars grew brighter overhead as the evening deepened, and Alina remained on her small balcony long after the wine had gone warm and untouched, simply breathing in the quiet possibility of a life that finally, truly belonged to her alone. 6 weeks after the confrontation in his office, Richard stood in a small conference room overlooking an unfamiliar skyline, listening to a regional director explain, with careful corporate language, that the overseas expansion project had been placed under indefinite review. The words moved past him in a blur, phrases like budget reallocation and leadership restructuring landing without truly registering, until the final sentence cut through the fog with unmistakable clarity. "Your position abroad is currently unfunded," the director said. "We may revisit the expansion in a year, perhaps 2. For now, we need you to remain in your current role." Richard sat frozen for a long moment, absorbing the news that dismantled, in a single conversation, the entire foundation he had built his future upon. The promotion, the relocation, the fresh start he had promised both himself and Vanessa, all of it evaporated with the same casual efficiency he had once used to dismiss Alina's entire life and future without a second thought. He left the meeting in a daze, walking through familiar hallways that suddenly felt disorienting, as though the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he could not fully comprehend. He thought of Vanessa immediately, dreading the conversation that awaited him, knowing that her reaction would likely mirror the anxious uncertainty that had been growing between them for weeks. He found her at her desk that afternoon, and the moment she saw his expression, she seemed to already understand what he was about to say. "It is delayed," he said quietly, "possibly canceled entirely." Vanessa's face went through a rapid succession of emotions, disbelief, frustration, and finally something colder and more calculating that Richard had not seen from her before. "For how long?" "They said a year, maybe longer." "That is not what we planned," she said, her voice tightening with barely controlled anger. "I turned down other opportunities because of this. I made choices based on the timeline you gave me." "I know," Richard said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "This was not something I could have predicted." Vanessa studied him for a long moment, and Richard felt, for the first time, a genuine unease beneath her gaze, as though she were reevaluating the entire foundation of their relationship in real time. Everything about this arrangement was built around that move, Richard. Without it, what exactly are we doing? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered, because Richard did not have a response that felt honest or reassuring. Their relationship, built quietly over the past year through stolen moments and carefully guarded secrecy, had always existed within the framework of an eventual future together. A fresh start in a new city where their relationship could finally step out of the shadows. Without that future, he was beginning to realize, very little of substance actually remained between them. Over the following weeks, the cracks in his relationship with Vanessa widened steadily. Small disagreements that once would have passed without much notice now escalated into prolonged tension. Vanessa grew increasingly distant, her attention shifting toward other opportunities within the company. Conversations Richard occasionally overheard about potential positions with different regional teams. Opportunities that no longer included him in the plans she quietly began constructing for herself. He found himself, during the quiet hours of increasingly sleepless nights, reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this uncertain and lonely place. He thought of Alina constantly now, not with the guilt he had expected, but with a growing and uncomfortable clarity about exactly what he had thrown away in pursuit of something that was proving far less substantial than he had once believed. He drove past their old house one evening, an impulsive decision he did not fully understand until he found himself parked across the street, staring at windows that were now dark and empty, the home officially listed for sale as part of the ongoing divorce settlement. He sat there for nearly 20 minutes, remembering countless ordinary evenings he had once taken entirely for granted, evenings that now felt impossibly distant and precious in hindsight. He thought of Alina's laugh, the specific way she used to hum quietly while cooking dinner, the comfortable silence they used to share while reading on opposite ends of the couch, silences that had never felt empty the way his current solitude constantly did. He had mistaken comfort for boredom during the final years of their marriage, mistaking the quiet steadiness of a long partnership for stagnation, when in truth it had been something far more valuable than he had recognized at the time. He reached for his phone that evening and composed another message to Alina, more vulnerable than his previous attempt, admitting openly that he regretted the choices he had made, that he understood now the true cost of the arrangements he had built without her knowledge or consent. He hesitated for a long time before finally sending it, watching the delivery confirmation appear on his screen with a mixture of hope and quiet dread. Days passed without a response. Richard checked his phone obsessively, refreshing messages with an anxiety that felt uncomfortably similar to the desperation he imagined Alina must have felt during the final months of their crumbling marriage, though he understood now that his current suffering could never truly compare to the betrayal he had inflicted upon her. He eventually learned, through a mutual acquaintance from their previous social circle, that Alina had moved into a new apartment, had applied for and received a significant promotion at her company, and appeared, by all accounts, to be thriving in ways that surprised everyone who had known her during the marriage. The news landed with a strange and complicated weight, a mixture of genuine happiness for her success and a deep, aching regret that he had not been the one to witness or support her in this new chapter of growth and independence. His relationship with Vanessa finally ended 3 months after the overseas position was officially canceled, a quiet and anticlimactic conclusion to what had once felt like an all-consuming passion worth sacrificing his marriage to pursue. Vanessa accepted a transfer to a different department, one that would minimize their interaction at work, and the conversation that marked their final separation felt strikingly similar to the one Richard had once initiated with Alina, cold and businesslike, devoid of the emotional intensity that had once defined their connection. "I think we both knew this was never going to last without the move," Vanessa said, her tone measured and detached. "It was exciting because it felt like an escape. Without that, we are just two people who made a lot of complicated choices for very little payoff." Richard did not argue. He simply nodded, absorbing the truth of her words with a quiet, resigned understanding. He had spent over a year believing that Vanessa represented an exciting future worth sacrificing everything for, only to discover that their connection had been built almost entirely on the fantasy of escape rather than any genuine, lasting foundation. Alone in his apartment that night, the same one he had moved into after the house was officially listed for sale, Richard sat in silence, surrounded by boxes he had still not fully unpacked months after the separation. He thought about the man he had been a year earlier, confident and certain that he was making the right choices, pursuing excitement and opportunity over the steady, quiet partnership he had built with Alina. That confidence felt entirely foreign to him now, replaced by a humbling clarity about the true cost of his decisions. He had lost his marriage, watched his career opportunity dissolve, and ended a relationship that had never truly been built to last beyond the fantasy that had originally fueled it. He was, by nearly every measure, worse off than he had been before making any of these choices, and the realization settled over him with a weight he found difficult to carry. He thought, too, about the version of Alina he had left behind, calm and composed as she walked out of his office, refusing to give him the emotional scene he had perhaps unconsciously expected. He understood now, with painful clarity, that her composure had not been coldness or indifference. It had been the quiet strength of someone who already understood her own worth, someone who refused to beg for a partnership that had already stopped valuing her long before the official conversation ever took place. He picked up his phone one final time that night, scrolling back through the messages he had sent her over the past several months, none of which had received a response. He considered writing again, composing yet another attempt at explanation or apology, but something stopped him this time. A growing understanding that his words, however honest, no longer carried the weight or relevance they once might have. Alina had moved forward without him, building a life that was thriving specifically, because it no longer included the arrangements he had once made so carelessly at her expense. She did not need his apology to continue that progress. She did not need his regret to validate the choices she had made in walking away. Richard set the phone down and looked around his sparse apartment, the boxes still unpacked, the walls still bare, a stark contrast to the warm, thoughtfully decorated home he and Alina had built together over a decade of shared life. He understood, finally and completely, that rebuilding his own life would require far more than simply waiting for forgiveness that might never come. It would require the same kind of deliberate, honest reckoning that Alina had clearly already undertaken in the months since their separation, a willingness to examine his choices honestly, to accept full responsibility for the pain he had caused, and to begin the slow, difficult work of becoming someone worthy of the second chances he was not even certain he deserved. For the first time since that afternoon in his office, Richard Hale finally understood that the arrangements he had once been so confident about had cost him far more than he had ever anticipated, and that no amount of regret could undo the damage already done. All that remained now was the uncertain, humbling work of figuring out who he wanted to become from the wreckage he had created, entirely on his own. Nearly 7 months after Alina walked out of Richard's office, she found herself standing in the elegant lobby of a downtown hotel, attending a company gathering celebrating her recent promotion to senior strategist. Priya had insisted on the event, wanting to properly recognize Alina's remarkable turnaround over the past several months. And Alina, though initially hesitant about the attention, had agreed to attend, dressed in a deep green dress that Marissa had helped her choose earlier that week. The gathering buzzed with quiet conversation and soft music, colleagues mingling near tables lined with appetizers. The atmosphere warm and celebratory in a way that felt entirely appropriate given how far Alina had come since the difficult months following her separation. She moved through the room with an ease that surprised even herself, chatting comfortably with coworkers, accepting congratulations with genuine gratitude rather than the forced politeness she might have offered months earlier. She did not expect to see Richard there. He appeared near the entrance almost an hour into the event, dressed in a dark suit that looked slightly ill-fitting, as though he had lost weight since she last saw him. Alina felt her stomach tighten immediately upon spotting him across the room, an old instinct rising briefly before she consciously steadied herself, reminding herself of exactly how far she had come since the day he had announced his other arrangements without any regard for how it might affect her. She later learned, through a brief conversation with Priya, that Richard had been invited by a mutual business contact unaware of their complicated history, an unfortunate coincidence that had placed them both in the same room without warning. Alina considered leaving early, avoiding the confrontation entirely, but something within her, some quiet and steady confidence that had grown significantly over the past several months, decided instead that she was fully capable of handling whatever conversation might follow. Richard approached her near the edge of the room, his expression a complicated mixture of hope and visible nervousness that Alina had never once witnessed from him during their entire marriage. "Alina," he said quietly, "I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I," she replied evenly, her voice calm and steady despite the unexpected surge of emotion rising within her chest. "You look wonderful," he said. "I heard about your promotion, congratulations." "Thank you," she said simply, offering nothing further, unwilling to fill the silence with the kind of nervous conversation she might have once used to smooth over discomfort. Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for her composed distance. "I have tried reaching out several times. I understand you have not responded." "I have not," Alina confirmed. "I did not see the point." "I meant everything I said in those messages," he continued, his voice growing more earnest. "I know I cannot undo what I did. But I have spent the last several months truly understanding how wrong my choices were, how much I threw away without ever considering what it would actually cost me." Alina studied him for a long moment, searching for the anger she had expected to feel in this exact scenario, the confrontation she had occasionally imagined during quiet moments over the past several months. But standing there, looking at the man who had once meant everything to her, she found instead a strange and unexpected calm, the kind of clarity that only comes once genuine healing has truly taken root. "Richard," she said finally, "I do not need you to understand what you threw away. I already understand it completely. I lived through discovering it. I lived through the humiliation of finding out my entire marriage had become a lie over a year before you ever admitted it to me." His expression flickered with visible pain, but Alina continued, her voice remaining steady and measured, years of quiet self-doubt finally giving way to a clear and unwavering sense of her own worth. "You did not simply make other arrangements that day in your office," she said. "You had already been making them for over a year, quietly behind my back, while I continued believing we were building something worth protecting. That is the part you still do not seem to fully understand. It was not the announcement that broke us. It was everything that came before it. Every lie, every late night, every excuse I believed because I trusted you completely." "I know," Richard said quietly. "I know that now." "Knowing it now does not change what happened," Alina replied. "And it does not obligate me to give you a second chance simply because you have finally arrived at the same understanding I reached months ago." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing her words without argument, and Alina noticed, with a small measure of quiet satisfaction, that he no longer carried the same certainty he once had, the same casual confidence that had once allowed him to dismiss her feelings so easily in that office all those months ago. "I am not asking you to take me back," he said finally. "I know that ship has sailed, and honestly, I do not think I deserve that chance even if you were willing to offer it. I just needed you to know that I understand now, fully, what I lost. I needed you to know that the version of me who said those words to you that day was not someone I am proud of, and that I have spent every day since then trying to understand how I became that person in the first place." Alina considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of them settle into something she could finally recognize as genuine, rather than the calculated apology she might have suspected from him months earlier. But genuine understanding, she realized, did not erase the consequences of his choices, nor did it create any obligation for her to offer forgiveness simply because he had finally arrived at a place of honest reflection. "I am glad you understand now," she said finally. Truly I am, but that understanding belongs to your own healing, Richard, not mine. I have already done the work of moving forward without you, and I have built a life I am genuinely proud of. I do not need anything further from you to continue that progress. I understand, Richard said, his voice quiet with what appeared to be genuine acceptance rather than lingering hope. I just wanted you to hear it directly from me, rather than through messages you never responded to. Alina nodded, appreciating, despite everything, the sincerity she could sense beneath his words. Thank you for saying it, she said. I hope you find whatever peace you are looking for, Richard. I truly do. But I hope you understand that my life now is built entirely without you in it, and that is exactly how I intend to keep it. She turned and walked back toward the center of the celebration, leaving Richard standing near the edge of the room, watching her go with an expression that mixed regret and something close to genuine respect. Alina did not look back, though she felt, for the first time since that difficult conversation in his office so many months ago, a profound and settling sense of closure, as though a final piece of unfinished business had quietly resolved itself in exactly the way it needed to. She found Marissa near the dessert table a few minutes later, and her sister immediately noticed the shift in Alina's expression, a lightness that had not been present just moments earlier. Are you all right? Marissa asked quietly, glancing briefly toward where Richard still stood near the entrance. I am better than all right, Alina said, and she meant it completely. I think I just said everything I needed to say to finally put that entire chapter behind me. Marissa squeezed her sister's hand warmly. How does it feel? Alina considered the question thoughtfully, watching the celebration continue around her, colleagues laughing and chatting, the soft music filling the elegant room, a life she had built entirely through her own determination and resilience over the past several difficult months. It feels like freedom, she said finally. Real freedom, not the frightening kind I felt the day I left him, but something steadier and more permanent. I do not need his apology anymore. I do not need him to understand what he lost. I already know my own worth, and that knowledge does not depend on him recognizing it. The two sisters stood together for a long moment, watching the celebration continue around them, and across the room, Richard eventually gathered his coat and quietly slipped out into the evening, leaving Alina to enjoy the rest of her celebration without the weight of unfinished conversation hanging over her any longer. For Alina, the encounter marked something significant, a final closing of a door she had spent months slowly, deliberately working to move beyond. She had faced him directly, heard his genuine regret, and had chosen, with complete clarity and confidence, that her own healing did not require his validation or his apology to remain whole. She returned to the celebration with renewed lightness, accepting congratulations from colleagues, laughing genuinely at conversations around her, fully present in a life that belonged entirely to her, built from the ashes of an ending she had once believed might destroy her completely, but which had instead become the beginning of something far more authentic and fulfilling than she had ever imagined possible. A full year had passed since the afternoon Alina walked out of Richard's office, and standing now in the sunlit gallery space of a small downtown studio, she could hardly recognize the woman she had once been during those difficult early months of grief and uncertainty. The walls around her displayed nearly 24 paintings, each one created over the past year, a visual record of her journey from devastation to genuine, hard-earned peace. The exhibition, her first ever public showing, had come together almost accidentally. A friend of Claire's, an art gallery owner named Bennett, had seen photographs of Alina's work during a dinner party several months earlier, and had immediately expressed interest in featuring her paintings in a small collective show. Alina had hesitated at first, uncertain whether her rediscovered hobby was truly ready for public attention, but Claire and Marissa had both insisted, reminding her repeatedly of how far she had come and how deserving she was of celebrating that growth publicly. Standing now among the small crowd gathered for the opening reception, Alina felt a quiet, steady pride swelling within her chest as she watched strangers pause thoughtfully in front of her work, studying the colors and shapes that represented months of careful healing and rediscovery. One painting in particular, hung prominently near the entrance, depicted a woman standing alone on a small balcony overlooking a city skyline, bathed in the soft gold light of sunset, her posture relaxed and open rather than burdened or afraid. "That one is my favorite," said a warm voice beside her. Alina turned to find a man she recognized from several previous gallery events, Daniel Cole, a soft-spoken architect who had struck up easy, comfortable conversation with her during 2 prior gatherings over the past few months. His interest in her work, and gradually in her company, had grown steadily over that time, though Alina had taken things slowly, cautious after everything she had experienced during the collapse of her marriage. "Thank you," she said, smiling genuinely. "That one took me the longest to finish. I think I kept changing the light until it finally felt right." "It shows," Daniel said. "There is something incredibly peaceful about it. Like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for a very long time." Alina considered his observation, surprised by how precisely it captured the emotional truth behind the painting. "That is exactly what it felt like," she admitted. "Finishing that piece felt like the moment I finally understood I was going to be all right, no matter what came next." They talked for nearly 20 minutes, comfortable and unhurried, discussing everything from the inspiration behind her paintings to Daniel's own creative process in architecture, a field he described with genuine passion that reminded Alina pleasantly of the enthusiasm she used to feel about her own work before years of quiet self-sacrifice had dimmed it considerably. As the evening continued, Alina found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled over the past 12 months. The senior strategist position she had once hesitated to pursue had become a role she now excelled in, earning recognition throughout her company for innovative campaigns that reflected the confidence and creativity she had rediscovered during her personal healing journey. Her apartment, once filled with unpacked boxes and uncertain beginnings, had become a genuine home, decorated entirely according to her own taste, filled with her paintings, her books, and small treasures collected during solo trips she had taken over the past several months, adventures she never would have pursued during her marriage. Her relationship with Marissa had deepened significantly during this transformative year, the two sisters growing closer through countless shared dinners, weekend outings, and quiet evenings spent simply enjoying each other's company, without the complications that had once existed when Alina's entire world revolved around accommodating Richard's schedule and preferences. She had reconnected, too, with friendships she had allowed to fade during her marriage, rebuilding bonds with women like Claire who had quietly worried about her distance for years without ever fully understanding its cause. These friendships now felt richer and more genuine than they had in over a decade, unburdened by the careful management required to protect a marriage that had, in hindsight, never truly deserved that level of sacrifice. The financial independence she had built over the past year brought her a quiet satisfaction unlike anything she had experienced during her marriage, a sense of security rooted entirely in her own capability rather than dependence on someone else's decisions. She had learned to navigate her finances confidently, to invest thoughtfully in her own future, and to make decisions about her career and personal life without needing to consider how those choices might affect someone else's plans or ambitions. As the gallery reception began winding down, Daniel offered to walk her home, an offer Alina accepted with a comfortable ease that would have felt impossible just months earlier. They walked slowly through the cool evening air, discussing plans for a future studio visit, a comfortable rhythm developing naturally between them that felt refreshingly different from the careful, cautious dynamics that had characterized the final years of her marriage. Standing outside her apartment building, saying goodnight beneath the soft glow of streetlights, Alina felt something she recognized immediately as genuine hope, not the desperate, uncertain hope she had once clung to during her marriage's final difficult months, but something steadier and more secure, rooted in her own established sense of self rather than dependence on anyone else's validation. "I would like to see you again," Daniel said simply, his expression open and sincere. "Whenever you feel ready." "I would like that too," Alina replied, and she meant it completely, without the anxious uncertainty that might have accompanied such a statement even a few months earlier. After Daniel left, Alina climbed the stairs to her apartment, closing the door behind her with a quiet sense of contentment settling comfortably over the familiar space. She moved through her living room, pausing briefly in front of a small shelf where she had placed a single photograph, not of her wedding day, but of herself standing confidently in front of her paintings during her very first gallery showing months earlier, a visual reminder of exactly how far she had traveled since that devastating afternoon in Richard's office. She thought briefly of Richard, wondering how his own journey had unfolded over the past several months since their brief encounter at her promotion celebration. She felt no lingering bitterness in the thought, only a distant, peaceful curiosity, the kind reserved for a chapter of her life that had fully and completely closed, leaving space for the far richer story she had since begun writing entirely on her own terms. She settled onto her couch that evening with a cup of tea, looking around at the home she had built entirely through her own resilience and determination, at the paintings that lined her walls, at the quiet, comfortable life she had constructed from what had once felt like complete devastation. She thought of the woman who had once sat frozen on a bench outside Richard's office building, uncertain of where to go or what to do next, and she felt an overwhelming compassion for that earlier version of herself, understanding now, with complete clarity, that the ending she had feared so deeply that day had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful than she could have possibly imagined at the time. Richard had made his arrangements without her, arrangements built on secrecy and betrayal that had ultimately cost him nearly everything he had gambled to gain. But Alina, in the year since that painful discovery, had made her own arrangements entirely, quietly and deliberately, one honest choice at a time, building a life defined not by loss, but by genuine growth, resilience, and hard-earned peace. She finished her tea, turned off the lights, and made her way to bed, feeling, as she settled beneath the covers, a profound and steady gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this exact moment. The path had been difficult, filled with heartbreak and uncertainty she never could have anticipated on that ordinary anniversary afternoon over a year earlier. But standing now on the other side of that devastation, Alina Marsh finally understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that she had not simply survived the ending of her marriage. She had transformed it into the beginning of the most authentic, fulfilling chapter of her entire life, built entirely, deliberately, and beautifully on her own terms. 2 years after that fateful anniversary afternoon, Alina stood once again in Bennett's gallery, this time surrounded by nearly 40 of her paintings for her first full solo exhibition, an achievement that would have seemed impossible to the frightened woman who had once sat frozen outside Richard's office door. The senior strategist role had evolved into a director position within her company, one she had earned through consistent innovation and leadership that colleagues frequently praised as transformative for the entire marketing division. Her relationship with Daniel had grown steadily over the past year, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than the quiet sacrifices that had once defined her understanding of marriage. They moved at a comfortable pace, neither rushing nor holding back, simply allowing their connection to develop naturally into something Alina trusted completely, precisely because it never asked her to diminish any part of herself to maintain its steadiness. She occasionally heard news of Richard through distant acquaintances, learning that he had eventually left his old company entirely, taking a quieter position with less pressure and fewer opportunities for the kind of ambitious excess that had once driven him toward choices he deeply regretted. He remained unmarried, and though Alina felt no particular satisfaction in this information, she recognized it as further confirmation that some decisions carry consequences that persist long after the initial choice has been made. Marissa had become not only her sister but her closest confidant, the two of them now planning an annual tradition of traveling together each spring, exploring new cities and cultures that Alina had once believed were reserved only for people braver or more adventurous than herself. She had learned, through the painful process of rebuilding her life, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. A lesson she now carried into every new chapter of her life with quiet confidence. Standing in the center of her exhibition, watching guests move thoughtfully between her paintings, Alina felt Daniel's hand find hers, warm and steady, a quiet gesture of support rather than ownership, exactly the kind of partnership she had once believed impossible to find again. "Proud of you," he whispered simply. Alina smiled, looking around at the life she had built entirely through her own resilience, at the paintings that told the story of her transformation from devastation to genuine fulfillment. And she felt, more strongly than ever before, a deep and abiding gratitude for the painful ending that had ultimately given way to this extraordinary beginning. She thought of the ring she had left on Richard's desk 2 years earlier, a small, deliberate gesture that had marked not the destruction of her life, but its true beginning. She had walked away that day with nothing certain except her own resolve, and in the years since, she had built something far more valuable than the marriage she once believed defined her entirely. She had built herself, fully and completely, on her own unshakable terms, and standing there surrounded by evidence of that remarkable transformation, Alina Marsh understood with complete certainty that she would never again allow anyone else's arrangements to determine the shape or worth of her own extraordinary life.